I hadn't seen the valley since I was a kid, but the valley hadn't forgotten me. The gravel turned to ruts, then to clay as red as rust. Trees pressed in on both sides like they were leaning together to whisper. My phone died 3 bends ago, no reception, no map, just that last mocking banner, searching. The lane squinted into a clearing and stopped there like it was ashamed to go farther. At the edge of the clearing, the old Merrill house tilted. The way a person with a secret might learn to lane so the secret won't spill out. The porch slouched. Kudzu stitched green scars up the siding. In the weeded yard, a circle of stones showed where my grandfather used to burn brush. There were still black shards inside, like this morning's fire had lost an argument with last year's rain. I shut off the car and listened. No birds, no power lines. The quiet here wasn't empty, it was crowded. It lay on the clearing in folds. And if you stood too still, you could feel it settling on you, testing your weight, deciding. It's 3 nights, I told the steering wheel. Sort the heirlooms, sign the deed, go home. My full name is Rowan Merrill, but out here 1 valley up from Harlow Ridge, they only ever called us the Merrills, because someone botched the spelling on a church ledger back when the road was still wagon-worn clay. It stuck, so did the stories about us. Granddad Ira counted weather with his bones. Grandma Loma could hear a copperhead in leaves by the shape of its silence. People said the trees around our house stood a little closer than trees stood elsewhere. As a kid, I believed them. You can afford to at 10. At 32, arriving alone with a borrowed crowbar and a roll of contractor bags, belief felt as thin as a last match. The porch steps complained under me but held. I tried the knob, it turned easy. A muscle memory so smooth it made my stomach dip. Inside smelled like dust, old coffee, and something mineral, like rain trapped too long in stone. The living room wore its years in the way old folks do, careful, folded, put away proper. The wool throw asleep over the couch arm. A jar of marbles, Grandad never let me swallow one, even when I swore I was trying. Grandma's knitting basket under the rocker, yarn slack as a river in August. A clock ticked somewhere in the hallway, one of those wind-up ones whose patience outlives the people who wound them. I found the breaker panel behind the pantry door and flipped the mains. Nothing. The co-op must have cut the line when Grandma passed. Fine, I'd brought lanterns. I'd stay long enough to sort what mattered and leave the rest for the estate buyer who didn't mind mildew in exchange for acreage. I set my bag by the stairs and started in the kitchen. Plates into 1 box, mason jars into another. I kept the ones with labels written in Loma's careful hand. Beans, 1984. Peach, 1991. 1 jar didn't have a label, just a thin cord tied around its neck, 2 knots, 1 knot, 2 knots again. The liquid inside had gone the color of weak tea, something like a ribbon floated there. I put it back on the shelf without opening it. Above the stove hung a small framed photograph, 4 men in canvas coats standing in a clearing I didn't recognize. The caption in pencil, Track 13 Survey 57. Grandad was 3rd from the left. Expressionless in the way mountain men sometimes are when they're trying not to spook a story. I lifted the frame. The nail came loose with a sigh and dropped to the counter. The photo was heavier than it looked. The backing paper had been cut and taped again, like someone had taken the picture out once and put it back in a hurry. Not my problem, I said out loud, which is how I knew it probably was. Dusk fell fast. The trees at the edge of the clearing turned into a single wall. And the clearing turned into a room with the sky for a ceiling. I ate a sandwich standing at the sink. The back window faced the tree line, which meant I could see my reflection hovering in the glass, a ghost that moved when I did. Behind that reflection, trunks shoulder to shoulder. If you stared long enough, the negative space between them looked like doorways. That was when I heard the 2-note whistle. It arrived from the trees, low and neat, 2 notes exactly. With a patience between them you could measure on a watch. The kind of whistle people in our family used to call dogs home with. The sound threaded the clearing and stitched itself to the kitchen window. It had that quality the very old and the very young share. It did not care whether you answered. I held my breath until it stopped, which took longer than breath was meant to last. When it finally went quiet, I told myself, barred owl, or wind through a split limb. Or something harmless wearing a shape my gut didn't like. I turned on the lantern anyway. There wasn't much to do after dark. I wound the hallway clock on habit, 3 turns, not 4. Loma had rules for everything and carried my lantern up the stairs. The 2nd floor landing had a window with a view into nothing. I turned the knob of the first bedroom on the left and felt the door resist, paint welded to its frame by years of quiet. When it gave, the smell got stubborn all at once. Cold dirt, wet iron, the sour breath of something that wanted you to know it had been damp for a very long time. Stop naming things, I told myself, you're just tired. I set the lantern on the dresser. The mattress sagged. The wallpaper, flowers on flowers, had begun to peel and curl like it was trying to point at escape routes. I lay down anyway, fully dressed, boots and all, with my hand on the flashlight the way some people sleep with rosaries. The house settled in small, thoughtful noises. Boards adjusted. Nails remembered their jobs. That two-note whistle didn't come back. I woke to a sound so quiet it felt like the house was trying not to wake me. A scrape, like fingernails testing a wet knot in wood, not frantic, curious. I didn't move. It came again under the floorboards, deliberate. The slow back and forth a person makes with a coin on a tabletop when they're trying to decide whether to spend it. There are explanations: mice, a possum, raccoon. You can stack them, one on top of the next, and build yourself a ladder out of fear. That's what I started doing, breath shallow, counting the scrapes like you count lightning until the thunder arrives. The scrapes stopped. A palm pressed flat under my bed from below, as gentle as testing a door you already know is locked. The mattress rose maybe a finger's width, just enough to let me know I wasn't imagining it, just enough to tell me it could do more. I found myself whispering, "Not tonight," which is a useless thing to say. But it made my lungs remember how to be lungs. The pressure withdrew. Silence arrived with both hands open. I waited for an hour I couldn't measure, and then a different noise came. The lantern glass ticked as it cooled, and outside something padded across the porch once, twice, as if counting planks. I did not sleep again that night. Dawn found me sitting upright, boots on the floor, spine rehearsing how to move without showing it was afraid. In daylight. The house performed normalcy like an old song. Cabinets, boxes, lists. I walked the perimeter to make it look like I believed in perimeters. The crawl space vents were intact. The house sat on stacked stone, dry as bone. Nothing dragged, no prints in the clay unless you counted the ones I was busy making. I told myself I was leaving on schedule. Night 1 survived, night 2 endure, night 3 sign. For morale I gave the house small names: the rocker, the clock, the blue plate with the chip that looked like Colorado. Leaving is easier if you can say what you're leaving. Around mid-morning. Found the trapdoor in the kitchen. I'd forgotten about it. Everybody knew it was there, but nobody used it. The house had a cellar under the back room, the kind of space you store jars in when you plan to watch winters accumulate. The trapdoor was cut clean, a rectangle flush with the floor, the seam shadowed by dust. The ring, just a bent spoon wired into an O, lay flat like a hand that doesn't want to shake. I set the lantern, pulled, and winced when the hinge yelped. Cold air climbed out, carrying the clarity of rock. It felt older than the house. I swung my legs onto the stairs and went down. The cellar was not big, packed dirt, brick piers shouldering the joists, a wooden workbench along one wall, its surface scored by whatever a generation does with a blade when it's waiting for anything else to happen. Jars lined a shelf, some held beans fossilized by brine. One housed a single marble, blue as creek light. Another held a strip of bark, peeled like a ribbon, curling against glass. Names had been carved into the bark through the soft inner layer, thin, exacting letters. I brought the jar close and read. Jonas Delahunt, 1913. Lucinda Delahunt, 1913. Frank Wicks, 1957. Ira Merrill, 1957. My grandfather's name looked fresh, not fresh as in recent. Fresh as in it had been added by someone who cared how letters were supposed to sit next to each other. The curve on the R in Merrill was a little flourish Grandma used when she wrote shopping lists. I looked away from the jar and realized there were more strips of bark tacked to the underside of the joists, like someone had decided the cellar beams needed labels. Bark dries and splits on its own timetable, but these pieces were patient. As if being watched trained them to hold still. "Why," I asked the cellar softly, "do you have a ledger?" The cellar, being a cellar, did not answer. Instead, the two-note whistle came again, but this time it came from the far corner of the room, through the gap where the foundation met the earth, as if the ground itself had learned a song and wanted me to hear the part it was best at. I turned my head slowly. In the dark corner, piled burlap sacks did the thing tired things do when they pretend to be piles. They breathed. I left the lantern where it was and climbed the stairs without running, which is something I will be proud of when I am old. Back in the kitchen, I shut the trap and set the heavy crock on top of it, not because I thought it would help, because rituals exist to remind hands how to do something when the mind has just met a problem it doesn't want to name. I went outside into a noon so bright the clearing looked shocked by it. The trees stood at attention. The air held the clean taste of creek water that doesn't belong to any creek you can point to. I told myself I was taking a break. I told myself I'd walk to the end of the lane, stand there at the gap where road pretends to be road, and prove the day had ordinary edges. Halfway down the lane, a nail on a poplar had been hammered high, where normal men don't reach without ladders. A board hung from it on rusty wire, and someone had burned words into the wood with a nail and a patient flame. The letters were skinned, thin, long, narrow, as if whoever made them had only ever learned to write in ash. No return trail, I laughed, a sound I wish I hadn't put into the air. It did not feel like a joke. On the walk back, I noticed the wire for the first time. A clothesline strung between two sourwood trees, 20 feet out from the porch, disguised because time was good at disguises. Gray bundles hung from the wire every foot or so, small and irregular. At first I thought they were wasp nests or the curls of old paper left to weather. Then lantern light from last night slipped forward in my memory and made a shape I didn't like. I went closer. They were bones, tiny ones, fingers of rabbits maybe, toes of raccoons. Each was tied with a strip of cloth, knotted twice like the jar in the kitchen. The cloth had symbols inked onto it in a brown that might have been walnut or might have been a thing I would not say in daylight. The symbols weren't letters I knew. Circles leaned through with a line, crooked spirals. A stick figure crowned with thorns that could have been deer burrs if you were thirsty for innocence. Something had gone to trouble, and trouble had gone to hang a warning. I stood there like a fool and read it as if it were meant for tourists. Okay, I said, okay. The rest of the day I spent making piles, keep, donate, burn. I kept second guessing where to put the framed track 13 photo. In the end, I wrapped it in an old feed sack and slid it under the bed I didn't want to sleep in. I ate before sunset. I checked the bolt on the front door twice. I put the revolver my mother swore I didn't need on the nightstand, Granddad's old, .38, the one he'd used to shoot copperheads under the steps. I wasn't going to fire at noises in old wood. I set it there anyway, rituals again. When the last light left the clearing, the night arrived the way big cats do, soft-footed, confident, uninterested in your permission. I lay on the mattress with the lantern turned low, not trying to pretend I'd sleep. The clock downstairs ticked. The house inhaled. I waited to hear whether the night would tell the same story it told before, or whether it had found a better one. It did not make me wait long. The two-note whistle came once outside, then once inside, not louder, closer. My name followed it, not shouted, not pleaded, said, as if it had been said many times before and would be said many times again, until the saying and the hearing and the answering wore down to one thin cord between two trees. Rowan, it sounded like my grandmother, not her voice as it was when she died, papery, a sound you could tear by accident, but the voice she had when she taught me which mushrooms to leave alone, patient even when I was not. Rowan, honey, come help me with the jars. All the places in me that wanted the past to unhappen stood up at once. It took everything else I had to keep the rest of me sitting. I can't, Grandma, I said to an empty room. Because rules are still rules even when you are alone. You're gone. Silence considered that. The house wood creaked softly in a hallway, not like footsteps, but like the memory of them. Then on the stair, 3 slow knocks, not the polite kind, not a demand, just the noise a fist makes when it lets a door know it knows. I stood with the lantern in one hand, the other on the revolver, to remind my heart that my hand knew how to be steady if it had to. Not tonight. I said again and heard how small it sounded. A sliver of light laked under the bedroom door. A shadow flowed over it and stopped. Something lined there, listening to how I breathed. I breathed quieter. The shadow didn't move for a long time, then from the floor below the floor the scraping returned. It traveled across the room, slow and certain, tested one board then another like a careful person with a map no one else had seen. It reached the spot near my right boot. It went still. Rowan, my grandmother's voice said from the other side of the door with perfect patience, "Be a dear, bring the ledger." Down in my chest, something very small and very old tried to fold itself into something even smaller. I had the sudden, unreasonable memory of the bark strip with the names. Jonas Delahunt, 1913. Ira Merrill, 1957. The curl of the R like Loma would have made it if she had done the carving herself, which of course she hadn't, because that would be ridiculous, and because I preferred not to stack that thought on top of anything else tonight. Under my feet, the plank lifted a fraction of an inch, like a person inhaling in preparation to speak. Then the trap in the kitchen, 2 rooms away and under a 50-pound crock, creaked as if someone below it had put a shoulder to the underside and remembered how doors forget themselves. The revolver in my hand suddenly felt like a question. The floorboard under my boot rose another hair. The lantern flame flickered toward it. I made it halfway to the door before I knew I'd moved. I slipped the revolver into my waistband, set the lantern down to keep both hands free, and turned the knob. The door sighed open. The hallway was empty. The air smelled faintly of wet dirt and old iron and the sweetness that comes when you peel bark from living wood. At the end of the hall, the stairs down to the kitchen held their breath. The first step groaned under my boot. The way old wood does not to betray you, but to warn you that it isn't the only thing listening. I went down anyway. The kitchen lantern burned where I'd left it, its halo small and stubborn. The crock on the trap door had shifted an inch to the right, not far enough to make a point. Something like fingerprints, long and wide apart, darkened the ring of dust around it. The 2-note whistle came from below, impatient now. As if the song had waited long enough for me to learn my part. "Bring the ledger," my grandmother's voice repeated from under the floor. The sweetness was gone. It had the flatness of a thing that has spoken 1,000 times and expects to keep speaking until the 1,000th. There are moments when a life decides itself, when your feet vote and they have more votes than your head. Mine voted to leave. I grabbed the car keys from the hook by the back door and pulled. The door didn't move. The lock wasn't engaged. The door simply stayed. It had learned how to be shut in the same house that had learned how to listen. Row. The voice under the floor said, patient again, a teacher who had found a lesson that worked. We won't take much. A new sound joined the old one's, footsteps beyond the porch in the clearing grass, soft, numerous, coming from the tree line as if the tree line had grown tired of pretending to be a boundary. I set my back against the door and pushed. Something on the other side pushed too, not in anger, in instruction. The crock slid another inch across the trap. I did what my grandmother taught me the summer we found a copperhead asleep under the laundry basket. I stopped trying to fight the wrong thing. I dragged the kitchen table, the one Grandma used for snapping beans, across the floor and set one leg on the trap door and the other earthbound on tile. Then I climbed onto the table and lifted the lantern onto the top cabinet shelf where its light could see farther than I could. Outside. The 2-note whistle answered itself from 3 different places at once. The bones on the clothesline rattled the way teeth do when a dream has decided it needs a mouth. The front door opened. No hands on the knob, no knock, just that long, breath-like motion of wood that has always wanted to be air. Something stepped over the sill, paused in the foyer, and considered the lay of the house like a man in a hat deciding which chair he'll favor before he sits. I did not draw the revolver. I did not want to teach the night something it didn't already know about me. Instead, I climbed down from the table slowly and crossed to the stove where the cast-iron kettle sat. I struck a match, lit the smallest burner, and set the kettle to heat. The hiss as flame found gas sounded almost human. Maybe that's why the footsteps in the foyer changed. The first one turned toward the kitchen, then stopped, then took a step backward. As if it had expected me to do anything but make tea. Rowan, the voice under the floor, repeated, relieved. That's right, bring the ledger. The kettle would whistle eventually. The human brain is a cheap instrument, but it still knows what a whistle is supposed to sound like. I needed one sound tonight that belonged to us and not to whatever kept borrowing voices. The footsteps in the foyer circled left, then right, testing thresholds the way fingers tested floorboards. They stopped where the hallway met the kitchen tile. Saw it then in the doorway because the lantern on the upper cabinet sent its light down at an ugly angle that showed honest shapes. Tall, shoulders narrow, head bowed not as if in prayer, but as if the hinge in the neck had learned a different angle than ours. Wrapped in something that looked like canvas when people wrapped canvas around a thing they intend to bury later and don't want to see until they have to. It looked at me without a face, not because it had none, but because it had practiced. And practice makes things smooth. Bring the ledger, it said, and this time it didn't borrow my grandmother's accuracy. This time the words dragged like a wet rope across a stone you cannot lift alone. The kettle began to sigh, the small preamble before a true whistle. The thing in the doorway tipped its head, curious as a fox studying a snap trap. "It's mine," I heard myself say, and I didn't know whether I meant the kettle, the house, the ledger, or the problem. Outside. The two-note whistles answered each other around the clearing, farther back now, as if sound had agreed to make a circle, and the circle was not for me. Under the table, through the seam of the trap door, a sliver of black widened like a pupil, and from the gap a hand rose. The fingers were longer than a man's, not monstrous, just one joint too many, a mathematical mistake corrected too late to undo. Dirt clung to the nails like a costume. The hand felt for the edge of the trap. It found it, it took hold. I put my palm flat on the stove top next to the burner and let the heat tell me the truth about pain. Then I picked up the kettle by the handle with my other hand and looked at the doorway and at the hand and at the jar on the shelf with bark and names in its glass, and I made a decision that would wound the clearing in a way it would remember. I poured the boiling water into the seam. The hand withdrew very gently, as if someone had tapped an old friend on the shoulder in a crowded room and the friend had turned to see whether the voice belonged to a story it wanted to hear. Steam rose. The kitchen smelled like fresh rain on hot iron. The thing in the doorway didn't move. The bones on the line outside rattled once, angry as a wasp jar. I set the kettle back on the stove, the burner off now, the hiss gone. The house listened. The clearing listened. And somewhere under the floor, in the corner of a small cellar where bark remembers how knives spell names, someone answered with a sound I will hear until I die. A voice not borrowed, but old, speaking a single word in a dialect that belonged to graves on a hill 2 ridges over. "Run." I didn't argue. I grabbed the Rap Track 13 photo from beneath the bed as I tore past the stairs. Because that is the thing people do in bad dreams when they become themselves. They snatch the one thing that will prove the dream had furniture. At the front door, I paused with my hand on the latch long enough to understand an ugly kindness. It had stayed open since it opened. No more instructions, no more pushing back. The yard between porch and car was only 20 yards of matted grass and clay. It felt like a mile a man tells about when he wants to be believed. The trees around the clearing were full of careful things that knew how to stand still. I did not look at them. The car door opened, the car door shut. The engine coughed and caught as if it had been waiting for its line. Gravel spat. The house tilted in the rear view the way a secret learns to hold its shape. The clothesline rattled. The two-note whistles wound around the clearing like string around a gift you do not want to open. I did not stop driving until the lane remembered how to be a road. Only then, with a strip of state asphalt under me and the sun already writing its name on the next ridge, did I glance at the passenger seat where the wrapped frame lay. The feed sack had come loose at one corner. The photograph backing had slipped. 3 men stood in a clearing I did not recognize. Granddad Ira III from the left. The caption, Track 13 Survey 57. And in the far left edge of the frame, where the trees shaded the world into almost, a 4th figure had been caught by chance when the shutter clicked. Tall, canvas-wrapped head tipped as if listening to a kettle trying to learn a different whistle. Its hand rested on a trapdoor I knew. Its finger pointed down. By the time the lane remembered how to be a road, my hands had learned how to be hands again. The feed sack with the photograph rode in the passenger seat like a passenger who didn't want to talk. Darnell had one gas station that pretended to be 2, gas on one side, coffee on the other. The sign over the door squealed when I tugged it, like it was being asked to remember a song it hadn't sung in years. Inside, the air smelled like fried dough and old stories. The woman behind the counter wore her hair in a gray braid as long as your arm and a visor that had never seen the sun. She looked up like she'd been waiting on a particular person, and I had finally done her the favor of being him. "You're a Merrill," she said, not asking. "Merritt," I said out of habit. She smiled like names were the first thing to rot. "Loma's boy." "Grandson," I said, close enough. She slid a styrofoam cup toward me. "If you're shaking, pour. If you're not shaking, pour anyway. It's the same pot either way." I poured. The coffee tasted like a tire had been politely introduced to a campfire and they had agreed to share a cup. It steadied me. "I'm Rowan," I said, because my grandmother taught me names are the smallest kind of bread. "Esmay Pike," she said. "My brother's out on the ridge, goes by Ode. Folks call him Odie when they want something and Mr. Pike when they've taken too much already." I glanced toward the window. The road pointed west like a question. MS, Pike, Esmay, she said. Esmay, are you? I set the cup down. The coffee wobbled. Do you know the old stories about houses that listen, about men in canvas coats who don't favor faces, about I stopped there because sound has weight and I had already lifted too much. Esmay's eyes went patient. You stayed the night at your place. Yes, you heard the whistle. Yes, you answered it. No, good. She wiped the counter like she was pushing crumbs back toward the plate. You burned water. I stared. I poured a kettle. Same thing. She tapped the counter with her knuckle, 3 polite little knocks. And did he knock? Yes, I said before I realized we both knew there was only one we meant. How many? She asked. Eyes on mine, 3. Then he knows you, she said. Not your face, you're counting. She leaned in. You don't open to the 3rd knock, not for any man, not for anything. First you hear him. 2nd you're measured. 3rd you belong. Your grandma had a way of saying it I liked. Don't let the mountains set your feet for you. Something loosened in my ribs at the way she said grandma. I hadn't known I needed anyone else to say that name out loud. You know what track 13 is? I asked. I slid the feed sack across. Esmay's hand hesitated, then took it. She eased the frame out like it might jump. Lord, she said softly. I haven't seen this in 40 years. She touched the corner of the mat the way people touch the corner of a coffin because the other parts are too much like what they are. That's Wicks, there's Ira, and that is Mr. Fenley. He was a forester for the co-op, bought out the rumor his job was supposed to be. 4th man was there. Camera didn't invite him, which is good manners for cameras. I kept my mouth shut. She turned the picture to show me the back. Someone had glued an old paper invoice there and written in pencil, track 13, survey 1957. Next to the numbers, someone Loma, by the curve of the R, had added, don't go again, not for this. Esmay slid the photograph back into the sack and patted it like you pat a stray dog you hope will remember you kindly. Ode will walk you to the line, she said. He won't cross it. He used to, doesn't anymore. Don't ask why. He'll tell you without the asking if the road wants you to hear it. I should go back at all, I asked. She looked at me the way women look at men when the men are about to do something they already decided to do. If you don't go back, it comes on into town after you, not because it's angry, because you make a hole in a shape when you leave. Holes invite filling. You'll learn that rule a dozen different ways before you're done. She put a small paper sack on the counter. For later, iron nail, bread heel, a good mirror, salt in a snuff tin, spool of red thread. Don't bargain with what you don't own. Don't whistle back. Don't say your name into a place that didn't ask it gentle. Do I pay you? You will, she said, and the way she said will made my skin cool. Go on, he'll be on the porch. Ode Pike looked like someone had cut a man out of mountain and told him to make do with whatever was left. Tall, hat pulled low. Beard a week past polite. He watched me step onto the boards with the same expression he might give a snake he intended to let cross the path. You're Ira's, he said. Ira's grandson, I said, but softer this time. He nodded. You poured water where it wasn't welcome. Tried to open the trap, I said. Traps try, it's their nature. He went inside and came back with a backpack he must have kept ready for years. He handed it to me. It had been a different color once. You can go to the line, you can look, you can leave. You're permitted those 3. If it calls you farther, that's not permission. That's courtship. It calls good. I followed his truck up a road the county pretended belonged to the county. We turned onto a gravel track, then onto a pair of ruts that were just that, 2 ruts, as honest as scars. He parked where a sycamore had grown in the middle of the old lane and didn't apologize. We walked the last half mile. This the way to your place? He asked without turning around. The back way, I said. You never use the back way, he said. Back ways are for coming home when you'd rather not explain from which direction you arrived. We came to the board I'd seen nailed high in a poplar, the one with burnt letters narrow as bone, no return trail. There was a second board below it I hadn't clocked from the lane. The weather had taken most of it. I could just make out track 13. The 3 looked like it had learned patience the hard way. Ode put his palm on the trunk below the boards. We set words where our arms reach. They set theirs where we don't. His knuckles tapped the bark twice, then once, not a rhythm, a disagreement. You hear knocks out here, you count M, then you count yourself. How do you count yourself? I asked. You take stock, he said. Feet, breath, teeth, what you owe, who you're willing to owe it to. He cut his eyes at me. You got the ledger. I told him about the jar with bark and names. Lucinda and Jonah's Delahunt, he said without blinking. Children, took sick for it, took a liking to them. Wicks never had a family, unless you count the men who cut timber with him and then didn't. Ira had Loma, names are not receipts. He stooped and pinched a pinch of dirt off the track. But promises are. Folks think bargains are made with even numbers. They're not. They're made with leftovers. What a man has at the end of a day is what he's willing to promise to keep from wasting. He scratched a shallow line in the dirt across the path with his boot. This is the line, not the old county survey, not where the map says, where the sound says, you step over, you mind your mouth, don't whistle, don't count out loud, don't pick anything up that already knows it's been set down. We'll walk to the first turning. You'll feel the corner like you're a nail and the corner's a magnet. That's where we stop. He stepped. I stepped after because I was tired of turning away from the parts of the world that wanted names. Inside the trees, the air held a temperature that didn't belong to the day. We walked with the kind of care you use when you're trying not to wake a sleeping house that knows your weight by heart. Ode kept his head turned a degree toward the left like he was listening to a voice only he'd earned. He never took 3 steps without letting one heel kiss the dirt like an apology. We passed what had been a fence, gone now to gray teeth frozen mid-bite. We passed a chimney with no house attached. Stones held together by moss that had memorized where mortar used to be. Ode knelt to press his fingers to the ground. Tracks, I asked. None, he said. That's what's wrong. The woods forget on a schedule. This is not the schedule. A sound arrived then, so plain it felt impolite not to answer. 2 notes, the same ones from my yard, spaced like they were waiting for me to admit something. Ode didn't stop walking. Don't look, he said. Do not name the direction. It can only walk where it knows the words for. If you don't give it a word, it only has the old ones. The old ones are slower than we are for now. I kept my eyes on the slope of his shoulders. We came to a place where the light turned a little greener, the way light does when it has passed through leaves that have decided to remember spring for another hour. Ode's hand lifted to a halt. He didn't turn around. This is the corner, he said. How do you know? I want to step left with every part of me that isn't bone, that wants not mine. I don't take directions from anything that can't grow moss. He reached into my borrowed pack and took out Esmay's little mirror. He held it at waist level, tilted toward the ground. In it, the path behind us looked wider than the path ahead. We'll stand here a spell, it'll take attendance. Something moved off to our right, as soft as paper taking breath. Ode's hat brim didn't twitch. You feel the knock? He asked. I hear leaves, I said. You'll feel it, he said. I did. The knock didn't come from a door because there was no door. It came through the ground itself, the way old houses let you know someone has climbed the porch and stood with his hand on the knob deciding whether to pretend politeness. 3 knocks. The third was lighter than the first 2, and that was wrong, because things don't get gentler on purpose unless they think you'll reward them for it. Don't answer none of them, Ode said softly. He'll knock 3. He always has since 1913. Before that, he just walked in. We taught him manners. Manners are a leash men put on wolves and then call it civilization. It holds until the first good snow. The 3rd knock finished. My mouth had been holding my name like a coin. I swallowed it. Ode waited. The 2-note whistle came again, but this time it tried a different interval, as if a person who'd always sung in thirds had worked up the nerve to try a 5th. It failed. The 2nd note scraped. It made something behind my ears itch. Someone taught him our whistle, Ode murmured. He's still practicing. Who would? Doesn't matter who, he said with a gentleness that wasn't meant for me. What matters is we don't sing back. We stood until the stillness changed shape a little, the way a worn glove turns once in your hand and then decides you're allowed to wear it. Ode handed me the mirror. You carry it, he said. It's not for looking, it's for making sure you're the one being seen. Things have to choose what to reflect. He turned then not back toward the line, but deeper. He took 1 step left, the way every part of him had wanted to before he told it no. He didn't argue with his own instruction, he just went. I followed because people do that even when they are old enough to know better. The ground sloped toward a narrow gully full of ferns that had no business being that green in this month. At the bottom, a dead oak lay like a ship hull turned wrong side up. A small thing crouched under the curve of the wood, a kettle wired to a branch, its mouth turned downward. The wire had been wrapped in a way that said a woman's hand had known what it was doing and had not enjoyed doing it. Ode knelt. Lomas, he said. She left it when Ira came back with less than Wicks. He touched the wire like it would bruise. Water that owns its heat, he said. You did good using it. Men who ask iron to do what water will do end up with iron that knows more than they do. Did he? I couldn't say the pronoun without hating my mouth for having chosen the easiest part. Did the knocking thing take Wicks? Ode shrugged in a way that didn't feel like a shrug. Wicks never did learn to answer slow. You can walk a long way in these hills by saying the wrong yes once. He tapped the kettle. Fill this with creek water. It'll boil when it wants, when it does. You said it where he knocks. Honest heat makes him undecide himself. Undecide, I asked. He doesn't change his mind, Ode said. He lets it go unmade. I filled the kettle from a slick ribbon of water that had no creek to speak of, just a habit of moving downhill. When I came back, Ode was looking up slope at a tree whose bark had been peeled in long, careful sheets. The trunk wore scars like ringlets where someone had cut, let heal, cut again, let heal again. Nails had been driven into soft cambium and left there to rust so that the tree grew around them with the resigned industriousness trees keep. Pinned to the trunk were strips of bark like the one in my cellar jar, thin, curling, carved with names that came from 3 different centuries and the same handful of families. Some letters were deep, cut by a hand that didn't fear a blade. Some were shallow, drawn by someone who had already decided to let the tree argue back. Ledger, I said without meaning to. Balance sheet, Ode said. You keep your math, it keeps its own. Sometimes the sums match. And that's a day you get to live ordinary. I stepped closer, careful not to cross the place where roots were closest to the skin of the earth. I read names I knew from old mailboxes and names I'd only ever heard at funerals. Delahunt, Pike, Wicks, Merrill, Harlow. The dates hopped like stones in a creek. 1913, 1957, 1978. A blank strip with no carves at all. And then, near my eye height, because whoever had carved it knew I'd stand where I stood, a shallow, almost there in sizing. Rowan Merrill, 2025. I couldn't tell if the breath I took came out. It's not deep, Ode said. It's a pencil line. It wants you to help it remember which letters it means. I reached without meaning to, palm raised the way you put your hand to a door you know belongs to you even when it's locked. Ode caught my wrist half a breath before I touched. No, he said softly. You give it heat and salt, not skin. He opened Esmay's sack. He poured a little salt into his palm and mixed it with what looked like ash from a cold fireplace. He spit into the paste, stirred with a broken twig, and handed it to me. Smear it in the letters. That's you saying, I see your math, but you don't get to balance it with my name. I pressed the paste into the shallow cuts. The tree shivered under my hand. Sap rose like tears it had kept to itself. The 2-note whistle sounded not far and missed the second pitch again. I could have cried from relief at the failure. Now, honey, Ode said. Honey. He took a small tin from his pocket and flicked it open. The smell was clover and July. Sweet means we're not enemies, he said. Doesn't mean friends. Means we intend to leave each other better than we found each other. He dabbed the honey over the saltash paste. The letters blurred. My name became sap and sweetness, and an argument the tree would keep making back at the cut until one of them won. A voice came from under our feet then, not the cellar voice, not my grandmother's borrowed patience. This one had the gravel in it old creek beds keep after a flood. Balance, it said. Ode's eyes closed just once. Ain't that a word, he whispered. He pointed with his chin. Set the kettle under the tree when it speaks like that. It's about to ask for more than it paid last time. The kettle began to rattle like a bug trapped under a glass. No fire under it, just an insistence in the water that had nothing to do with physics. Steam pulsed at the spout in short breaths like a runner coming off a hill. It started to sing. From the left, 3 knocks answered, not on wood this time, on stone. It sounded like a fist on a grave marker, polite and patient because there was no hurry. Don't answer. Ode said too quietly for anything but bone to hear. I did not answer. A figure stood then, 20 yards beyond the ledger tree, and I would not have seen it if Ode hadn't turned his head to keep from seeing it. Tall. Wrapped in a canvas coat the color of churches' basements. No face you'd remember. Its head tipped toward the kettle the way an animal tips its head toward a bell it has decided to let be language. It lifted one long arm and knocked 3 times on the trunk of a hemlock with careful knuckles. The hemlock didn't answer because trees have better manners than we do. Bring the ledger, it said. And this time the voice had borrowed not my grandmother's tone, but the quiet a courthouse clerk uses when the people in front of the desk already know what the answer is and just want to hear it come out of a mouth. I looked at Ode. He shook his head the slightest fraction. It knows you carried the picture, he murmured. Pictures are ledgers when they're kept long enough, but it wants the bark jar. He can't keep a good book without the bark. What happens if I bring it? I asked. You don't bring it, Ode said. You carry it, he takes it. He lifted his eyes at last, and when a thing that old holds a list, it forgets to let go. He turns ownership into whether you don't bring it. The figure stepped closer. It made no sound you could call a footfall. It knocked again. The third knock was light, and it felt like a finger tapped the edge of my name inside my chest to see if the carving had taken. The kettle shrieked then, sudden and fierce. As if it had finally found its note, steam jetted. The canvas-wrap Ed head cocked a degree in a way that made some tender part of me want to stop looking. "Go," Ode said, voice gone hoarse in a hurry. "We're not going to the line, we're going out the other way. Always have at least 2 ways to stop belonging to a place. You got one, make 2. He moved fast for a mountain cut out. We slashed through ferns and around the dead oak's rib. The whistle followed. Tried a cleaner second note, failed again, and grew irritated in a way that tasted like copper at the back of my tongue. "Don't run," Ode said, and then, because kindness sometimes comes dressed as truth, but don't walk slow. We came to a shallow, washed gully where rain had sketched a new path downhill with a pen the county would never admit existed. Ode jumped it. I took it wide. Behind us, 3 knocks struck through the ground at once. Far apart, the way you call cattle from 3 corners of a field. The sound lined itself up under my ribs. When we broke out into light, it felt like surfacing, like a held breath you hadn't known you were counting, finally had somewhere to go. We stood in the ditch a long minute, and Ode took his hat off and put it back on as if to make sure he still wore the same person he always had. "You're going to have to go back tonight," he said, as if we'd been talking about supper. "Before sundown, if you can stand it. Before third sundown, if you can't. You'll bring the jar. And you'll not bring it to give, you'll bring it to move it. We're ending that ledger." "How?" I asked, and the way the word came out made me sound 10. "You'll put names where the ground can't read," he said. He held up Esmay's spool of red thread. "And you'll bind what can still be bound to what will not betray. You know what won't betray." I shook my head. "Bread," he said. "Bread," I said. "It was alive, and then it died, and it rises again when a woman tells it to." He said, which was the kind of sermon a man like Ode could give with a straight face. "It knows about held breath. It knows about heat. It knows the way a house listens good when good is what's cooking." He began walking toward where he'd left the truck. "Also, it's good policy to feed the living when you're talking to the dead. It reminds you which end of the conversation you belong on." We reached the vehicles. Someone had pressed 3 long, dirt-dark fingertips into the dust on my trunk lid. They weren't prints exactly, because prints are pansy and detailed. These were the idea of fingers. They had stopped just short of the glass, like a courtesy you don't expect and can't trust. I swallowed. Esmay said not to bargain. "You won't," Ode said. "We'll pay, that's different." He thumbed toward my passenger seat. "Don't leave the picture in the car. Pictures get lonesome in the dark and start opening their mouths." I tucked the photograph into the backpack like it was a live thing. The road back to Darnell had learned a new way to be rutted in the hour we were gone. Everything looked like itself and 1 degree off. At the Pike place, Esmay was waiting on the porch with the kind of patience that could hold a county flat in a windstorm. "You crossed the line," she said, which was not praise. "We stepped to it," Ode said. "He cut his name," she said without looking, and I realized she meant the tree. "Not me did it take. It's arguing," Ode said. "Good." She handed me a wrapped loaf, still warm. "Use this to bind the bark when you rewrite it. You'll know where. If you don't, your hands will know. Trust them. They've been in your family longer than the rest of you has." "I have to go back before sunset," I said. "You'll go back before the 3rd one," she said, "but you'll try for the 1st because it's kinder to your bones. You'll need a jar with holes in the lid, a good nail, a match that hasn't learned to fail, and the names you want to keep. Don't lie. Lying makes the woods polite. Polite woods keep books." She partly smiled at my face. "Don't ask, trust me, you don't want to meet a polite mountain." I drove back out toward the Merritt place with the loaf on the passenger seat and the photograph in the backpack and the knowledge in my blood that some hours weigh more than others. The clearing looked like it had been practicing all day to look the way it always had. The clothesline wire still wore its knots. But the little bones were gone as if they had been granted a better appointment. The front door stood exactly the way I left it, open and not. The kitchen smelled like iron and water and the ghost of bread my mind had decided to install so I'd have something brave to walk into. I set the loaf on the counter, cut 2 slices, and left them on the sill. I whispered thank you to a house that had learned to listen to other kinds of speech more than mine. I moved the crock from the trap. I lifted the ring, cold climbed, Rowan, my grandmother's voice said from below, and this time I knew for certain what I had suspected before. The voice was not my grandmother's. It was something that had taken pains to polish itself on her patience. I brought the ledger, I said, and the way the floor under my feet held itself told me the house did not like that sentence. I went down the stairs anyway. The lantern swung. The cellar light wrote old letters on old dirt. On the shelf, the jar of bark and names waited where I'd left it. I took it in both hands. The air shifted the way air does when a man you cannot see has leaned his shoulder into a door and decided to keep leaning until a story breaks. Above me from the kitchen, 3 soft knocks came through the floorboards, not loud, not angry. The kind of knock you barely hear because you already know who's there. I didn't answer. Something in the far corner of the cellar uncurled with patience, sharpened to a point. This time when it spoke, it didn't borrow any voice I loved. "Bring it," the corner said. The lantern flame shortened as if a mouth had kissed it. I put the jar under my coat, against my ribs, where names and breath might argue like they belonged to the same country. I pocketed the iron nail and the snuffed tin of salt. I held the loaf of bread under my arm like a baby. Then I started up the stairs. On the 5th step, the knocking stopped being polite. 3 strikes, fast and flat. Like a hand that had learned the job a long time ago and had been waiting a very patient century for the house to hire it again. On the 7th step, the house whispered with its timbers, a sound that was not language and somehow translated itself into one, hurry. On the 9th, the trap door lifted against my shoulder as if something under it had decided to meet me halfway. And on the 10th, when my head rose into the kitchen light, I saw him proper for the first time, not through a doorway, not at the edge of a frame, but standing at my table with his hand on the wood like a landowner surveying his lines. Canvas wrapped, head tipped. No face you could teach a child to draw and get the child to sleep after. He lifted his knuckles, turned them down, and knocked on my table 3 times, once for here, once for now, and once for whatever comes between those 2 words when you don't have a mouth to hold it. The kettle on the stove, a kettle I had not put on the stove, began to sing.